that is the tension. That is the tension at the heart of this notion of the free market, is that it goes hand in hand with an extraordinarily large governmental role in security and policing.
For most people, the existence of markets is something natural. We buy our food through markets, we rent the places we live in through markets, and our work as well takes place within a labor market. We often think that markets are a sphere of freedom, where different participants come together and exchange goods in ways that benefit everyone involved. But according to today's guest, Bernard Harcourt, this idea of a harmonious and self-regulating market sphere is actually a myth. He further argues that what we often think of as unregulated market freedom in fact depends on extensive forms of regulation, policing, and coercion outside of the market sphere. In today's episode, he traces the long history of this idea of market freedom and shows how what appears natural today was in fact constructed over centuries. So let's now turn to Harcourt and ask why the idea of a free market is, in fact, an illusion.
My name is Bernard Harcourt, and I write and research in the area of critical theory, political theory, punishment studies, and legal theory. I teach law and political theory at Columbia University and at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. A vast majority of the politicians, journalists, managers, and ordinary people believe that the market is the most efficient way of organizing economic exchange, and that it has a tendency in its own somehow naturally or spontaneously to serve as a mechanism that makes things work. It's kind of a natural lubricant that makes the economic exchanges function properly. If you conduct any kind of survey, you'll get approximately, around 75% of people thinking that the free market is the best system. Here's a quote, and I'll ask you who you think said this. The market is the best mechanism ever invented for efficiently allocating resources to maximize production. I also think that there's a connection between the freedom of the marketplace and freedom more generally. So you might think that's Milton Friedman, or you might think it's Friedrich Hayek. You might think it's someone from the Chicago School. But it's actually President Barack Obama saying that in 2008, so after the financial crisis had begun, after Bear Stearns, one of the largest investment firms, had tanked. He would say, the market is the best mechanism ever invented for efficiently allocating resources to maximize production. It's really remarkable. It's something that is ingrained. It's something that, of course, is part of neoliberalism, but it's also just ingrained in people's understanding of the world. And when someone like President Obama adds that, again, freedom of the marketplace is tied to freedom more generally, that also has that assumption that economic free market causes political freedom. So the origins of the idea trace to the idea of natural order, natural orderliness, which had a divine component in the 18th century. This idea that of an invisible hand, right, or of the benefits of the free market, goes back really to the first economists who in France were called the physiocrats, François Quesnay, Le Mercier de la Rivière, and others, the physiocrats who believed that within the sphere of, for instance, agricultural production, um, there was a natural form of order. They talked about in terms of natural order. It had, of course, a Christian underpinning to it. And at the time, it was relatively explicit, although what the physiocrats were trying to do was to kind of eliminate the religious layers and leave us simply with the idea of orderliness. So the idea is that there is a orderliness to the economic system, to the economic sphere, and disorderliness outside. It's not as if the whole world or the whole universe is orderly. There is an idea of orderliness for the economic realm. For the physiocrats, it was specifically the agricultural realm. But for later thinkers in the Adam Smith vein and laissez-faire, it was in the industrial production realm, that there was an orderliness there. And it went with the idea that there was disorder outside. So, for instance, one of the things that Quesnay wrote was that all that is required for the prosperity of a nation is to allow men to freely cultivate the earth to the greatest possible success and to preserve society from thieves and rogues, right? So it's freedom in terms of exploitation of agriculture, but then there is disorderliness, thieves and rogues outside, and government needs to take care of that, okay? That is what gave birth, really, to this paradox of orderliness and disorderliness, the paradox of the fact that government should not interfere at all in the economic realm, but instead should be relegated to policing severely the outside realm of society. The notion of natural orderliness would give rise, say, in Adam Smith's writings, to this idea of an invisible hand, or Mandeville, the idea of private vices, public virtues. Right? If people pursue their own interests and are left alone, and there isn't government regulation, that will benefit everyone. It is what would give birth then to ideas of laissez-faire, and ultimately later on to Hayek's notion of spontaneous order, or ultimately the University of Chicago school theories about the efficiency of the market. The idea of the invisible hand, of course, is this idea that, if people pursue their private interests, it's good for the common good. So there is an invisible hand that makes everything work out best for the public. But when you think about it, that idea of an invisible hand goes back to a religious notion of God's hand, right? I think that you could tie the idea of the invisible hand back to the ordeals in the Middle Ages, because what the ordeals were intended to do, the ordeal by trial by fire or trial by water, where someone would be drowned to see whether they had in fact sinned, or trial by battle, right? All of those were intended to allow the hand of God to decide the outcome. Trial by battle, which we think of today as being barbaric, but the idea was that the victor would win because of the hand of God, right? God would interfere in a way and make the virtuous person, the not guilty person, win. That is the religious, those are the religious threads that would lead to notions of natural order, and then, of course, to notions of the invisible hand. And it's those ideas that would give birth eventually to today what we talk about in terms of market efficiency, right? The markets are the best mechanism, the most efficient mechanism, as President Obama would say, the most efficient mechanism. And what is it? It's because there is some kind of naturalness to them. They operate in a way to create efficiency.
As Harcourt argues, the myth of the free market is built around themes with an almost quasi-religious character. The market comes to appear as something with its own fateful logic, a system that, if simply left alone, will supposedly regulate itself harmoniously and move towards self-imposed homeostasis. According to Harcourt, this idea was later taken up, transformed, and radicalized by the so-called Chicago School of Economics. Here, the older idea of a quasi-religious natural order was recast in the language of science and economics. The market was no longer justified as part of a divine or natural harmony, but instead as the most efficient mechanism for organizing society.
So, in modern times, starting in the second half of the 20th century, really, these ideas of natural order were picked up by the Chicago School. The Chicago School were a bunch of economists at the University of Chicago and there were two traditions really going on at the University of Chicago that was picking up on natural order. First, there was the Friedrich Hayek tradition, which was a more libertarian tradition. Staunch believers in freedom and from a libertarian perspective. Hayek came to the University of Chicago, was actually brought to the University of Chicago in the 1950s, funded by a conservative foundation. And he developed these ideas of spontaneous order. And that was a modification. It was no longer called natural order. It was called spontaneous order. And he would influence a large strain of thought within the Chicago School that would include thinkers like Richard Epstein, Milton Friedman, who were on the libertarian right, believing in the virtues of the free market. There was another strand in the Chicago School who were utilitarians, essentially, and who had relied mostly on Bentham's early work and on Bentham's embrace of forms of laissez-faire economics. This strand would be represented by someone like Richard Posner or Gary Becker, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And they, and interestingly, they in part relied a lot on an Italian thinker from the 18th century by the name of Cesare Beccaria, who had been an early thinker of utilitarianism, also in the context of crime and punishment. He famously wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishment. So you had two strands that were developing. One, a more libertarian spontaneous order theory, a Hayekian theory, and another, a more utilitarian theory of efficiency. And those would come together actually with another Nobel Prize winner, Ronald Coase, who developed the Coase theorem and who would show that left to their own devices, rules would evolve towards efficiency. And what that gave birth to then was a new language, a new discourse of free markets. It had a different character. It was more scientific. It was updated. It used quantitative methods. Gary Becker was a great mathematician, and so all of this was then repackaged as through equations and updated science of economics. And so what had originally been a quasi-religious faith in the natural orderliness of agricultural exchange, for instance, transformed into a scientific tenet, right? Became science. And with that, of course, uh, a much more robust and convincing argument about the supposed efficiency of free markets.
The market utopia envisioned by the theorists of political economy would not be possible without the central role of the state. The government is meant to shield the market from interference, while at the same time maintaining order everywhere outside the market sphere itself. Because of this, the ideology of market freedom pushes for deregulation and privatization, and insists that the state should stay out of the economy as much as possible. At the same time, however, it relies on expansive systems of surveillance, punishment, and social control beyond the economic sphere. Harcourt describes this institutional arrangement as neoliberal penalty.
So you have to understand then that there's this deep paradox at the heart of the notion of natural orderliness, of the invisible hand, of the free market. And the paradox is that, on the one hand, government is viewed as incompetent and inefficient in the economic sphere. But on the other hand, government is relegated to all of the forms of policing and the military and security to ensure that there are no rogues and thieves, as Keynes had mentioned. And so what you have is this: on the one hand, the government is not playing any role in the economic sphere because it's incompetent, but on the other hand, playing this role in security and policing because of its competence there. And that paradox was already in place with the physiocrats. François Quesnay, a brilliant thinker. François Quesnay was remarkable. In fact, François Quesnay only turned to economics in his 60s. He was a doctor before that. He was actually a doctor. He was actually Louis XV's doctor at Versailles. And all of a sudden, in his 60s, he turns to economics and he develops these ideas. But as he's developing them, he's also giving a very important role for government and laws to regulate the outside of this sphere. He was particularly interested in despotism in China, and he came up with this idea of legal despotism, this idea that the laws had to be despotic and severe with regard to anyone who is breaking the law, right? And so quickly it was tied. This kind of laissez-faire was quickly, already immediately tied to forms of harsh policing on the outside for those who are disorderly. It's remarkable, but even the physiocrats, another physiocrat, Le Mercier de la Rivière, who wrote a book on natural order, that was the title of it, became governor of Martinique, one of the French colonies at the time. And one of his first acts as governor of Martinique, and one of the most important one, was to set up a police, right? It was the first police force down in Martinique. And it went hand in hand with all of these ideas of freedom in the economic sphere. That is the tension. That is the tension at the heart of this notion of the free market, is that it goes hand in hand with an extraordinarily large governmental role in security and policing. In the United States, for instance, we have, on the one hand, forms of deregulation and supposedly a free market. We have, on the other hand, the single largest prison population by number and by rate in the whole world, right? By 2008, we had 1% of our adult population behind bars, numbers exceeding 2.3 million people incarcerated. We have extraordinary military expenses, an extraordinarily large budget for the military. And so all of these forms of government, large government in the security areas, prisons, policing, military, is in sharp contrast then to this idea that actually, we need to have no government because things work out better that way. So that's the deep opposition, which is what I call neoliberal penality, essentially. It's the paradox of neoliberal penality. On the one hand, there's neoliberalism, and on the other hand, it's accompanied with the most intense, uh, largest penal sphere in the world. And so you have to understand that the idea of natural order is that there should be no role for the government in economic affairs, in agricultural affairs. Quesnay developed what was called a tableau économique, a very famous tableau. Actually, Marx spent a summer trying to decipher this tableau économique. And it was a zigzag. It had 3 columns, and it was a zigzag between producers and consumers. And what it tried to show was that productivity, agricultural productivity, could only increase if there was no government intervention. Quesnay was trying to depict or model an engine, a closed system that created value, in his case, agricultural value, simply through economic exchanges between parts of society, but excluding any governmental action, right? And so that was the heart of the intervention, that this self-enclosed, naturally orderly engine would produce value and economic wealth. And what you had to do was to exclude government intervention. And that very same idea continues today. Basically, it was picked up by thinkers and politicians like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, during what we now call the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s, Giscard d'Estaing in France as well. And the idea was that we should get the government out of regulating the economy, right? So we should do what was called at the time deregulation. Of course, deregulation is a myth because it's actually a re-regulation, but it was called deregulation. The idea would be that supposedly the government would stop regulating, or efforts to privatize industries, privatize companies. All of these were policies and practices that were promoted by what we call neoliberalism. Now, I mean, you have to understand the term neoliberalism is a complicated term because it can cover discourses, ways people talk about things. It can cover particular policies, such as privatization or deregulation, supposedly. And it can also cover certain practices and institutions. So, for instance, the IMF became very closely associated with the notion of neoliberalism because the IMF, through the Washington Consensus, through these understandings coming from Washington, D.C., that we should deregulate and get the government out of economics, the IMF pushed those policies on countries that were borrowing money from the IMF. So neoliberalism is a complicated, at least 3-dimensional concept involving those institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, involving certain policies, but also involving just a discourse, a way of talking. And that was what was so important and played such a big role with someone like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. But then also it was absorbed by people like Barack Obama, as you heard, right? The markets are the most efficient mechanisms, and they are associated with freedom more generally. That kind of discourse became dominant, and is what we would call neoliberalism. So the idea of neoliberal penality, then, is that these discourses and institutions of neoliberalism are embedded within or kind of go hand in hand with severe punishment practices. Those punishment practices are, in the United States, forms of mass incarceration, racialized mass incarceration. The numbers are the rates are incredible, 1% of the adult population. But when you get to certain demographics, for instance, African Americans or young male African Americans, you're talking about, 30% of a particular group being incarcerated behind bars, punished. I mean, the penality side is really uh, shocking. I spend time in the courthouses, whether it's in Alabama, in New York City. If you go to the arraignments where people are where they come after they've been arrested and detained, it's just a series of young African American men coming through the court. And you'd think you were in the antebellum period in the United States. Now, these forms of penality, which include prisons and policing, but also surveillance, NSA surveillance, the militarization of police forces. It's true in the United States. It's true in Europe as well. The French gendarmerie, the CRS, are militarized. I mean, they look as if they are soldiers, right? The militarization, all of those constitute what I refer to as penality, severe penality. And so the argument of neoliberal penality is that what goes hand in hand, paradoxically, because these are really at odds with each other, is this idea of freedom on the economic side, but strict, severe policing on the social side.